Yeah.
Let's see. Yes. Bom, eu vou abrir a conferência, eu vou abrir em português e falar brevemente algumas palavras em inglês, mas eu queria agradecer muito, parabenizar a professora Laura Guimarães, ao professor Pablo, a iniciativa. Deixa eu tirar. E dá para, assim, tenho certeza que será uma manhã, um final de manhã bastante interessante, bastante proveitosa. Queria agradecer a Paula também por se dispor a estar participando da conferência e do debate. E I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Georgiou, for being here with us. I'm sorry, it's a pity we are not here physically, but one day, maybe, in a short time, we'll be all together, and I think this is a first step for this intense academic exchange. Thank you very much, and I'll be here watching you all.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, Ms. Georgiou. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Myria Georgiou for her time and interest in being with us here today. I'm sure it will be a great pleasure to hear your conference, Digital Solidarity and Public Space in Pandemic Times. So I will briefly present Professor Myria Georgiou. She is Professor of Media and Communications and Research Director at the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. And she has a PhD in Sociology from LSE, a Master's in Journalism from Boston University, and a BA in Sociology from Panteion University, Athens. And her research focuses on media in the city, urban technologies, and politics of connection. Her work has been published in English, French, Portuguese, Japanese, and Greek. She is the author of Media in the City, Cosmopolitanism and Difference, published by Polity Press in 2013, and Diaspora, Identity and Media, Diasporic Transnationalism and Mediated Specialities, published by Hampton Press in 2006, and many articles in journals. So the floor is yours, Professor Myria Georgiou. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to join you. And again, I'm hoping that one day we will be meeting face to face and not very long from now. But for now, it is at least a great opportunity to be able to talk online. And taking that the topic of today's lecture is digital solidarity, in many ways, it makes perfect sense to have this exchange online as well. So I believe Pablo is going to be handling my slides. So Pablo, if we could open them now. Thank you. So before I start, I would like to thank first and foremost, of course, Laura Guimarães Correa for that invite, but of course also Bruno and Paula for welcoming me here, and Luciana Furtado and Pablo Moreno, who are on the background of this conference and supporting its smooth organization. So the title of my presentation today is Digital Solidarity, Public Space and a Pandemic. And this is a lecture that offers an opportunity, I hope, to think of urban life in the context of a crisis, especially as we're trying to grasp the realities and the reconfigured realities of how the public space of the city is formed and how we experience the public space in the city when we have no other choice but to be distant, when we have no other choice but to be cautious and worried about the people around us. So we have to keep a distance from the people who are part of our networks of solidarity and support, our co-workers, our colleagues, our neighbors and friends. So what I will be arguing today is that as we struggle to manage this crisis, we need to zoom into our cities and our neighborhoods and to try to see how urban citizens not only become how urban citizens manage the current crisis, not only by becoming vulnerable victims of a global health crisis, but also by becoming agents of urban life and urban change. In fact, I would argue, and I will try to show in different ways in this talk, urban citizens are the agents of common life, who are involved in shaping the politics and ethics of a changing urban world, especially at times of intense local and global crisis. Next slide, please. I'm going to start this conversation by quoting Maimouna Mod Sharif, who is the executive director of UN Habitat, the organization of the United Nations that focuses on the cities. So Ms. Sharif wrote recently, as you can see on your screen, around 95% of people with COVID-19 live in urban areas. This has brought into sharp relief some of the fundamental inequalities at the heart of our towns and cities. COVID-19 will hit the most vulnerable the hardest, including the 1 billion residents of the world's densely populated informal settlements and slum, as well as other people lacking access to adequate, affordable, and secure housing. Without a house, it is impossible to heed the call to stay at home. Without safe shelter and access to basic services, the order to shelter in place has no meaning. This quote, I think, is a stark reminder that the COVID-19 crisis is an urban crisis. The pandemic has brought many cities, perhaps most of the cities in the world, for a long time into a standstill, and even after life started becoming more normal, where the cities are experiencing a new normality that is dependent on the discouragement of a common public life. COVID-19 has imposed enormous restrictions, as we know, to public life right now, and also in the months to come, and perhaps with consequences for the years to come. The biggest challenge of this transformation is that public space and our common life in the city is largely shut down. This is not only a challenge, but it is also a paradox, because this shutting down of public life, this separation that we are forced to have from each other, is coming at that precise time that we need more than many times before to be closer together. Next slide, please. So what happens when our vulnerabilities increase, but proximity and publicness decrease? What happens when public life, as we take it for granted in the city, moves online? Urban scholars, historically, such as Jane Jacobs and Richard Sennett, have repeatedly reminded us that it is public life that makes the city's organic spaces of identity, of community, of conviviality. So how do urban citizens respond to a crisis that has taken away that very quality of urban life, its publicness? Do urban citizens commit to each other against separation? Do they support each other, or do they distance from each other and build on politics of suspicion and competition and fear against each other? These are questions that, of course, are not fully understood yet, and we're trying to make sense of them as we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, of course. And they are often not very systematically addressed by the key players of the crisis, those who are shaping the discourse and the actions to protect the urban citizen from the crisis. And these players, the key players, of course, include policymakers, they include the media, but of course also academics, as part of that urban and transnational community where we try to make sense of what is going on and also offer some thinking tools and some solutions to what is happening. In the public discourse surrounding the pandemic, it has become now normal to think of citizens as subjects who are either at risk of infection or who represent risks themselves for infection. And this, of course, is a dehumanizing duality, which either because of the health risk or because of the politics of fear has become prominent. And the narrative of the victim or the threat reduces, of course, humans to biopolitical machines and deprives them from recognition as agents of the city, as members of publics. Next slide, please. Against that background of fear, I want to zoom into everyday life and look at the urban citizens as the agents of public life, an argument that is I want to repeatedly emphasize. So I want to zoom into the everyday life of the urban citizens to talk about the ways that they have reconfigured public life and how this public life is reconfigured, perhaps partly lost and partly reimagined. In doing so, I turn to the context of urban life and its digital reconfiguration more specifically, especially through the notion and the practices of digital solidarity. I talk a lot about digital solidarity here today, and I talk a lot when I'm trying to make sense about the way that I understand publicness in our cities and urban life. So what do I refer to in relation to digital solidarity? I will come back to talk about it in more detail, but for starters, I want to just mention that I approach digital solidarity as citizens' spontaneous and diverse online responses to the pandemic. Responses that aim to support other citizens and to digitally bring capabilities, individual and collective capabilities, at least in the short term, capabilities of care in the context of crisis. Digital solidarity is primarily focused in the context of crisis and to social distancing in providing support, tangible support such as food, medication, but also emotional support to those who need it the most. I emphasize digital solidarity as I think that even though it is understudied in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, it reveals how the city responds to the crisis when its most fundamental quality is under threat, its publicness. I want to speak to the different expressions of digital solidarity as I have observed it among the urban citizens of a place I know the most, and that's the European city, and in more detail, perhaps of London, where I live. And I know, of course, that this comes with enormous bias and limitations in regards to the claims that I'm making, but I'm hoping also that some of these claims are also relevant to your different spatial context. And while I speak, you will hear me talking again and again about citizens. And I'm referring here to urban citizens who are not necessarily just the national citizens, not just the subjects that enjoy the recognition and access to rights as these are defined within the nation state, but also all the different all the different participants in the city urban life, all the different constituencies of the urban life that include formally recognized national citizens, but also undocumented migrants, refugees, and other marginalized communities that lack this recognition from the state, but who should have access to the resources of the city and to the right of to the city. Next slide, please. Digital solidarity, as I mentioned already, remains largely untheorized, but at the same time, paradoxically, is also over-celebrated. Felix Stadler, who has written a book specifically on digital solidarity, talks about it as a new culture characterized by the values of sharing, cooperation, individuality, participation, and diversity, and one rooted in the lived experience of sharing. Delfanti and Laconesi also speak of digital solidarity as the building of common, open, and autonomous spaces which trigger public responses that enabled collective reappropriations of standard experiences. And in recent work, work that I'm doing right now with colleagues at the LSE, but also with colleagues in other world cities, we're trying to figure out what this digital solidarity is all about. So we have been thinking about digital solidarity in relation to the interdependence through mutual concerns of attachment and recognition. In dialogue with the existing literature on digital solidarity, we understand it as a project to enhance and to extend these relationships through digital means. It is important, of course, to remember that digital solidarity is enacted within the material and digital spaces of inequality, but also the spaces of oppositions and opportunities that already exist in society. And they're situated within the conflicting and continuous uncertainties that might emerge in unequal cities, but also in the context of crisis, and which digital technologies might enhance or address more effectively. Digital solidarity, of course, takes its meanings within the social and political context where we see its different expressions. And for myself, as someone who's interested in city as an unequal space, but also as a space of identity, solidarity, and recognition of difference, I have been particularly intrigued by the city's response over the last few months and in the context of the pandemic. And I want to share some of my preliminary findings from this current moment of urban transformation and my initial reflections on the rise of digital solidarity and its meanings in the context of the pandemic. This observation fall broadly within three main headings and relevant questions. So firstly, I want to ask whether digital solidarity generates new publics in the city. Secondly, whether it constitutes a digital urban transformation, not just an occasional change. And finally, I want to explore the qualities of digital solidarity, meaning that I want to think a bit about the kinds of publics and the kinds of ethics digital solidarity generates at the present moment. Next slide, please. So what intrigued me to start this research was how swiftly public urban life moved from the material street of physical co-presence to the digital street of digital and online co-presence. It is important for me to observe that because urban life, in its ethics and politics of publicness and solidarity, has proved to be much more contradictory than we usually assumed based on our observations of the realities and ideologies of the equal and neoliberal city. So instead of, or alongside the desired and more recent enforced and most recently enforced withdrawal from each other, we have seen how citizens have been engaging in an explosive emergence of new networks of solidarity going digital. Perhaps what we could identify as new publics of and for a crisis. In the UK, for example, we have seen a massive digital response to the call from the state for volunteers to support the national health system. So when the state made a public call for 250,000 volunteers to support the public service, 3 times this number registered online to offer their support within days. But even more impressively, and what interests me the most, is that in a decentralized and bottom-up way, we have seen a politics of mobilization in the context of crisis and the emergence of another set of heterogeneous digital decentralized network of solidarity that emerged very fast outside the structures of the state and the market. And in fact, this is a multifaceted and diverse network of mutual aid, which I will be talking to in a bit more detail, which emerged within weeks and which gave rise to a public that works in many ways against, not in parallel, but also against the structure of the state and the market. The network of the mutual aid groups started in the UK in early March with a handful of groups initially concentrated in the inner city of London. And only within 2 or 3 weeks, it has grown into thousands of local mutual networks of solidarity and micro networks, which are mostly organized through WhatsApp groups and which are spread across the country, but which are mostly organized within cities. It is now estimated that 2.5 million people are involved in at least one of those WhatsApp mutual aid groups. These are groups that are covering one's own street and one's own neighborhood, but also some of them expand across larger parts of cities. For the last 6 months, I have been trying to follow and understand what possibilities this network present to social urban life, and focusing in particular on understanding if and how and under what circumstances these new urban publics are driven by values of equality, and whether and how they act on the basis of an ethics of care. Mutual aid groups, which represent, I think, one of the formations of this network of solidarity, that we see different formations of them in different cities and in different countries, reveal themselves as imagined and manifested new urban publics. And they have become new urban publics because they are determined through their public interaction and outward-looking orientation, and because they connect digitally to bring together strangers within a common aim. That aim seems to be to support each other, and to support those who are more vulnerable, and to compensate for the constraints imposed to the publicness of the city, precisely because of the health risk, but also to compensate for the constraints to the publicness and to public support that has to do with the restricted access to public services and to public space, because the state and the market are not able to correspond to people's needs. The horizontality of those networks, their scale, their speed of their development, and their reach are the product of a global crisis, a global and an urban crisis. They have significant implications also for understanding how new urban publics emerge to enact new digital solidarity in cities of social distance and isolation. The cities we're experiencing now are, again, not the cities we knew even a few months back. Most importantly, those networks have revealed how publicness has moved from the centers of the city, from the public squares, but also from the shopping malls, but also from the cinemas and the theaters, how it all moved back to the neighborhood, to the micro-public of the neighborhood. And that return to the neighborhood has been a fundamental, I think, shift in the way that public life and urban life is enacted. Also, it is important how the values of mutual aid and self-organization have been diffused, and have been diffused ideologically, not only spatially, within these diverse networks of mutuality. This mobilization that we see mostly, again, speaking from my experience from a European city, but perhaps this is also relevant to other cities, this mobilization takes place at the level of the street, of the neighborhood, and most importantly, and to a large extent, among people who have had no previous activist experience, but are now organized and who are becoming active in supporting their neighbors on hyper-local networks of solidarity. These very hyper-local, very local networks that are organized on, especially on WhatsApp. Next slide, please. We could thus perhaps talk indeed about a transformation of public life and also of solidarity. Acts of mutuality emerge digitally through collective reappropriations of standard experiences in this case. So the collective reappropriation of standard experiences that we observe here are most obvious perhaps in the extensive use of WhatsApp and of WhatsApp sociality for purposes of solidarity. So WhatsApp has changed its role in everyday life from being a very mundane tool for communicating, very mundane communication, casual interpersonal communication, to being the main tool for organizing solidarity and local action in the context of the pandemic. The recent and intense rise of digital solidarity in cities across the world has attracted, in many cases, substantial media attention, of course, as perhaps all of us know. So the media, like many policymakers, have jumped on the bandwagon of technological utopianism, observing the extent and the effectiveness of digital solidarity networks in the urban neighborhoods, to talk about, in different ways, about digital solutionism, and in trying to understand the phenomenon through the great potential, that utopian potential that technologies offer to change the cities, to change the way that we relate with each other. We have often seen then, in the last few months, celebration of the fast and effective rise of digital solidarity, as this appears out of nowhere, magically, just because it's the result of the pandemic. But importantly, the observation of the transformations of publicness and solidarity needs to be understood in dialogue with both the long-standing and the new crisis conditions of urban life. So, for example, cities have been intensely connected digitally. They have more effective digital infrastructures than other places, at least the larger cities in the world. But while they're being intensely connected, of course, we shouldn't forget that cities tend to be the most unequal places in the planet, and they're unequal places both in terms of their socio-cultural constitution, but also in terms of their digitality and the access to digital resources. The spontaneous solidarity responses by citizens have emerged not as a miracle, as the media and policymakers want to tell us, but as a necessary response driven by citizenship. These are acts that we observe in these networks that support to those who need them: food, medication, help for people to move out of isolation, and so on, are acts that aimed to compensate for failing institutions and failing market systems that could not support citizens in the way that they needed it. Especially in places like the UK, but also perhaps this is not irrelevant to places like Brazil. And in the context of austerity and neoliberalism, we saw again and again state structures failing citizens and corporations also failing citizens, especially as they have ended up getting enormous amount of money and huge profit by participating in different acts of dealing with the pandemic. For example, in the UK, we have major corporations signing lucrative contracts for tracking and tracing, but also alongside the state, them as well failing to meet the requirements of the citizens. Alongside the state and the market, we also saw the non-governmental sector. We saw non-governmental actors failing or really struggling to meet the needs of those who most need them, especially people among marginalized communities. And at the same time, and not coincidentally, of course, we saw citizen-led digital solidarity reacting fast and offering that tangible and necessary support when the state, the market, and the non-governmental sectors were failing. For the media and conveniently very often for policymakers, digital solidarity, because of its effectiveness, as I mentioned already, became very soon a novelty, a celebrated novelty, and of course, let us not forget, a free novelty of an offer of free labor for effective action and effective organization of urgently needed care on the ground. This care is represented very often as depoliticized, more like a charitable act that is very individualized and diffused rather than a political and collective action. So digital solidarity is understood in the public domain mostly as digital and less as solidarity, less as a political act. In response to that frame of the public discourse and the ideological framing of digital solidarity as an individualized act of care, a charitable act of care that has nothing to do with politics, we need to ask a number of questions. So how novel and how digital is this kind of solidarity after all? So first, next slide, please. No, sorry, please go back. We were fine. So first, it was in my observations of the mutual aid groups, it was very interesting to me to see how their early emergence and the most active mutual aid groups emerged in the inner city. That means it emerged in places where we have already had histories of local mobilization, local activism, and local political actions more generally. So campaigns for justice for the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire in London, for example, is a case that we can draw on when we think about the inner city responses to state-inflicted tragedies and other tragedies that marginalized groups, especially that occupy inner cities, are well aware of, they have experience of, and they have histories of being organized in addressing them. So the new digital street networks that we're seeing in the context of the pandemic build on those long histories of urban activism. That's the first point I want to make. The second observation concerning the novelty and how digitization changes the city or not is that many of the new hyperlocal activists that mobilized in the context of the pandemic might have never been activists themselves in the past. And this is very impressive. So in many ways, we have a whole new generation of activists, a whole new generation that became active, became aware and involved in public life only in the context of the pandemic and perhaps only digitally. However, this is a new generation of activists who who learned how to be activists through established grassroots movements and through their encounters with other activists, with existing activists who have long experience of being political. So, for example, several mutual aid groups in London and eventually on the national network of mutual aid groups across the UK adapted the queer care guidelines for supporting those in need effectively, but without exposing themselves to infections. So queer care is an established grassroots organization that is looking into after health concerns in the LGBT community. So it is very impressive that those 1,000 new mutual networks of solidarity actually organized their action across the country by following guidelines for one very grassroots organization, but a very grassroots organization whose appeal in the moments of crisis spread across the country. The third finding is that these new alliances from the level of the street to the national level emerged on and through social media. So through social media, these new activists linked next-door neighbors to each other, but also to each other across the country. So we have seen the emergence of a multinodal network with looser connections rather than with denser connections. While this multi-scale connectivity we have seen is impressive in its bid and extent, the same network's primary focus remained and still remains intensely rooted in the immediate locale. So the most active mobilization takes place at the level of the neighborhood and very often even at the level of the street, one's own street. The digital response to COVID-19 has been effective then and that's my third observation, precisely because it builds on what we were already used to and what we were already doing. Communicating, organizing, and connecting with people we know, or people who our friends know, and who are very familiar to us, they look like us, and people who we can identify with. Only this time, this expanded connectivity with the familiar happens more intensely because of need, in response to a new shared challenge. Next slide, please. So these observations, these three observations, for me raise some ethico-political questions. What publics does digital solidarity generate? What is the quality of the ethics and the constitution of these publics? More specifically, who is included in these publics? Who is included in this new project of digital solidarity, and who is excluded? And how effective is digital solidarity when it comes to cities that are already and have always been unequal? New evidence shows that already existing inequalities in cities, of course, have been even more intensified in the context of the pandemic, as the pandemic has disproportionately, as we now know, affected those who are already marginalized and most vulnerable. The urban, racialized poor, victims of domestic violence, those financially unstable, or those digitally disadvantaged. In my study of newly emergent networks of digital solidarity, I observed how the more visible hyperlocal solidarity becomes, the less visible that solidarity towards those beyond the proximate and the familiar seems to be. So hyperlocal solidarity becomes more directed to the familiar, with those who are unfamiliar becoming increasingly invisible in these same networks. As neighbors mobilize to support each other, we have seen food banks, for example, across the UK, cities shutting down because they could not get a donation, and their provisions have dried out as people needed their support more and more. Life for many of those who already lived in the margin of the society became even more unbearable because, of course, of the overcrowding at home, domestic abuse, hunger at home, suspended lives at home, and of course, inaccessible public services. So we see how not only all divisions became exaggerated, but also how new divisions are emerging. And they're not emerging outside our understanding of digital mobilization, reconfiguration of publicness, and that emergence of new digital forms of solidarity. So new divisions emerge as well alongside the old ones. So for example, we rarely now see in the news and in the media, social media, mass media, how refugees remain trapped in the dehumanizing conditions of camps and detention centers. We rarely see them, how these camps, these non-places have become even more dehumanizing, as they're now guaranteed and completely sealed from the eyes of the citizens, the eyes of the outside world. This image and knowledge is becoming even more invisible within those urban imaginaries of conviviality that is promoted and celebrated and largely realized for certain people in networks of digital solidarity. And they're becoming even more invisible than before because they're hidden behind the material and informational fences that have been raised even higher in the context of the pandemic. So alongside refugees and undocumented migrants, victims of domestic violence, there's who are given little or no support. We see them being hidden within oppressive homes, precisely because the value of staying at home and staying in has become privileged, a privileged value of solidarity, and the value that we all have to adhere to. And the digital solidarity networks remind us of this predominant value. But within the promotion of these values, stay home, stay safe, all those marginalized communities become even more hidden, even more divided from privileged sections of the society, and digital solidarity communication becomes an ordinary way to enhance existing or new divides. At the same time that we see those divisive discourses everywhere, we also see a justified celebration, perhaps, among digital networks of the transformation of transformed publics into communities. So what we see is not only the emergence of new publics, but also new communities. We see people celebrating how that initial connection at the moment of crisis brought to life new communities. So one of the consequences of digital solidarity is that we're moving also from publics to having these qualities of more or less sustained communities. This community spirit is worth acknowledging, of course, because people have in occasions moved, in occasions with publics have turned into communities, have moved from sharing information to sharing resources and lifestyle. A celebration, of course, that reminds us that again and again, the urban citizens can support their neighbors. Only we're also reminded, of course, that certain neighbors seem to deserve more support than others. So such reassuring and genuine commitment to each other has enhanced values of solidarity, but also it has enhanced invisibilities. Those who have to go out and those who have to work in the street seem to be completely, or at least almost completely absent from the new communities of solidarity, from this new digital solidarity network, which have been assembled around the common need, but also the privilege of staying at home. Those who have to go to work, especially the manual workers who cannot but expose its labor to constant risk, don't seem to be part of the conversation on digital solidarity. They don't seem to be even acknowledged very often as actors, as constituents, as members of the urban citizenship. Those who cannot work digitally, like most of us have the privilege to do, are almost non-existent in the social imaginary of the new urban public life. Those who are vulnerable and are often also judged based on their needs, but also on their assumption, based on the assumption of their own pathologies. So on social media, on WhatsApp groups, and also in the mass media, we hear questions in relation to those vulnerabilities. So are these people actually vulnerable because they deserve us, for us to recognize them as vulnerable? Or actually do the working class, elderly, the disabled, and so on, are they actually self-inflicting these vulnerabilities? Because they don't follow the rules, because they don't follow the driving values of staying at home and social distancing, and because they don't take precautions. These are narratives that are creeping within this new politics of fear, but also politics of solidarity that privilege certain lifestyle, certain privilege itself, and ignore or hide others. This narrative becomes widely diffused in social media and mass media and pays little attention to the possibility that for some people, staying at home means overcrowding, abuse, or full isolation. The intense connectivity of digital solidarity needs to be understood also in relation to the rise of invisible borders that divide publics based on class, ethnicity, and race in the city. What we sometimes observe is how invisible but persistent borders of the material street that exclude many of the city's resources, from the city's resources, are now becoming hyper-visible on the digital street. These acts of bordering sometimes become justified through the celebration and acclaim of those newly emergent community spirit that unites us all. A spirit that we have to remember that can also, of course, exclude. Next slide, please. We know, even without such conditions of cities, that social media, of course, can also generate and even encourage surveillance from the bottom up. Surveillance of citizens by citizens, or what some scholars like Steve Mann called surveillance. In the midst of the COVID-19 crisis in the UK, like in many other countries, I believe, the state developed its online tools for surveillance, for citizen surveillance, specifically for reporting those who are breaking the law, those who are breaking the rules. Numbers of citizens in the UK who reported anonymously and online other citizens has skyrocketed, have multiplied by tens or hundreds. Concerns of surveillance and control becomes even more pressing, not only at the level of the neighborhood, but also if we zoom out at the level of the city, of the nation, but also the world. The need to contain the pandemic, as we know, has accelerated governmental and also corporate uses of technologies of tracking. COVID-19 tracking apps were created fast and with little control over what information they collect and who controls the kind of data that they collect. So important questions are being raised all the time about the suspension of fundamental rights to privacy and data controlled by citizens. And consequently, compliance to technologies and economies of control often become diffused as citizens become digital vigilantes, and punitive, discriminatory, and anonymous publics are on the rise, and they're on the rise on their phone and on their WhatsApp networks. And the concerns here, of course, are many, I would argue, not only in the context of the crisis, but also in the context of the preconditions that are created right now about the world that we will inherit in post-crisis times. The rise of normalized bottom-up and citizen-generated surveillance and control of public space to which citizens give their consent is now perhaps more real than ever. It's more real and here to stay for the times to come. Next slide, please. So in coming to the end of my talk, I want to raise several questions for which I want to throw to you as provocation, because I still don't have the full answers, and I'm sure they will generate many thoughts and informed thoughts also from your side. And I want to raise questions by returning to this idea of publicness during the pandemic. How is public life lived and by whom? What kind of co-presence and mutuality does digital solidarity reveal? The digital street, as I try to show, generates possibilities for mutuality and solidarity that would be unimaginable outside the scale and the speed that is allowed to us and enables us to organize and to mobilize on digital networks. Many people have been receiving food and medication that they desperately need because neighbors mobilize digitally to provide that support. Many others have found comfort in everyday communication and the digital co-presence of others in the same network. Digital solidarity powerfully shows that urban publicness is not disappearing, but it is reconfigured within digital imagination and action. An imagination and action that supports urban publics in neighborhoods and cities. Yet an imagination and action that at the same time enables potential of the digital street to reshape the cities in ways that they're not necessarily desirable. The unforeseen constellations of the material street, which makes the city a real place, a vibrant place, according to Walter Benjamin, are increasingly diffused into the sociality of the digital street. This sociality is, of course, and as I try to show, this sociality is selective, and it is generated by and through the digital filters that individuals set, that social media encourage, but also which the algorithm prescribes. The stranger within that context of the digitized publicness, the stranger can be pushed even further away. And can be further away not only through the practices, but also through the social imaginaries of our digital connectedness that reproduces ideas of the very familiar other, of the very familiar cities, with voices of the unknown and those who are strangers being kept away. We thus need to ask ourselves, as we move to the next stage of the global crisis, and as we try to imagine what kind of world we will inherit after the crisis. If our public life is more and more enacted digitally, who are and who will be the owners and the users of the material urban street? If we have been pushed away from the material street, will we ever return? Who are the actors that live in the city digitally, and who are those who live the city materially in that material street? Is it perhaps those actors that have no choice, the minorities and the working classes, that have no choice but to live the city's publicness, and as they have to use the street and provide the resources that the privileged few, the privileged urban citizens who are perfectly happy to reconfigure their social and professional life as we do right now from the safety and enclosure of their home? Were the claims to the right to the city being made when publics and the city dwellers become more and more separated between those who occupy or have to occupy the material street and those who enjoy the safety and the closure of the digital street? And what legitimacy do these claims to the right of the city have if they're made either on the digital street or the material street, as the two become more and more divided on the basis of class and race? How can we imagine post-COVID solidarity and post-COVID collective action in public space if our effective relation to the city, to the neighbor, and to each other becomes increasingly digitally generated and rooted only towards and directed only towards those who are already on the network? These are important questions, I think, that do not only concern the specific moment through which we experience the city, we're experiencing the transformation of the city's publicness, but also questions that we need to think more and more as we're thinking about the kind of cities that we will see emerging in post-crisis world, in times that perhaps we will need to understand both publicness and solidarity in different ways. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Miriam. Paula?
Yeah, okay, you can go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Myria, for this fascinating lecture. It raises many important questions, and it provokes thoughts, especially in this time when we're trying to make sense of something that is happening, just trying to think about something that is happening now. I don't think what we'll be talking about in 5 years, so it's quite a challenge to get to analyze and to see what's going on now. But first of all, I did not thank you for being with us here. I'm very happy to have you here. Professor Georgiou was supposed to be a visiting professor at UFMG this year, but the seminars had to be postponed because of the pandemic. So hopefully this will be possible in 2021, fingers crossed. But this is the way we meet nowadays, digitally, and so it's a pleasure to be able to hear you and about cities, urban communication, continue this dialogue we've started about 5 years ago when I was at LSE at your department. Also I want to remember that this open conference is part of a course called Communication and Public Space that I teach with my colleague of the department and research group, Pablo Fernandes, who's in the backstage helping us with the transmission and the translation. So hopefully my students, some of our students are there watching us. Thinking about your ideas about solidarity, and especially about the selective solidarity, where some humans are considered more humans than others. I was thinking about some article we read in this course from Brazilian scholar, a very important one called Muniz Sodré. He's a Black scholar from Bahia. He is an emeritus professor in Rio de Janeiro. And he was talking about the double bind, this idea of Gregory Bateson in communication. He takes this concept from psychology, and it's a kind of communication dilemma where a child, but it could be anyone, would receive a double contradictory signs and messages. And he compares this to the logic of separation and bond at the same time, and binding at the same time in Brazil, considering, and this would be in the root of racism in Brazil, thinking that we have a proximity, but at the same time, there is a separation. It's like being together, but not wanting to be equal and to be in the same places, for example. So thinking, and this as heritage, a legacy from the slavery, because enslaved people would be very close to the free people in their houses, so with some very closeness, but at the same time needed to be kept away. So this is one of his theories to understand how Brazilian society would function. So I would relate this idea of a selective solidarity to this kind of double bind that Bateson puts. But Europe hasn't lived the colonialism as the South, global South has. So this is not the way European society is structured. So maybe the other in European society, not only are others, like the refugees, the migrants, also people from Black people and from ethnic minorities. But I'd like to hear you about these others that you can see in London and in the European context, and just to ask you if this concept makes sense to you. This is just one of the questions that your lecture would raise, but I'd like to hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Let me first address something that you raised at the beginning that troubles me as well, that we are trying to make sense of what is going on now, not something that has happened in the past. And I think this is a very difficult task that we have, but also responsibility that we have as social scientists, because unfortunately, I think we're in this, we have to deal with this predicament. Decisions are being made at the moment, societies are being shaped at the moment in the midst of crisis with consequences for after the crisis, that if we try to give ourselves that space and that distance to make full sense of things, it will be too late because so many decisions will already be made. So I think we have to continue the conversation, even if our thinking is still a bit raw. And I appreciate that many of the things that I'm saying, perhaps some of them will be relevant in a few months or years, perhaps others will not be. But we have, I think, to be part of this public conversation. Sure. In relation to the argument and the double bind, I think it's a very interesting approach, and I think it's one of the interesting ways through which social divides are being discussed in social sciences. It seems through psychoanalysis and how these inherent divides are being normalized in the society, right? By negotiating proximity and distance in very kind of careful ways, if I understand correctly, but that reproduce racial hierarchies. Obviously, the history of the UK is very different to that of Brazil in terms of the colonial or in terms of colonialism, but not necessarily that those racialized responses to the crisis. Perhaps they are not fully different. So what we see, and this perhaps relates also partly to a question that was raised in the chat by Carlos de Andrea, that what I was trying to speak to is this extreme complexity and contradictory nature of those digital networks of solidarity. Many of these digital networks of solidarity emerge in very liberal parts of the city, and their participants, they're perhaps their biggest proponents and activists, tends to be quite liberal people and people in the left. But what we see emerging is a very kind of nuanced a reproduction of divisions in the city on the basis of class and on the basis of race that are never spoken about as being on the basis of race or in the basis of class. So people are being targeted not on the basis of class or race, for example, but because they do not adhere to the values of the perceived solidarity in the context of the pandemic. But the people who are named very often and identified as not adhering to those values are the people who are precisely located within very specific racial and class positions in the city, right? So we see this kind of new forms of racialization and classism in the city that emerge in a very nuanced way, that divide the city, but without being talked about. So the old divides of the city are never named, but ironically, they're being very much reproduced, not unlike, I think, what you have said. Just to take the second part of the question, since I addressed partly the question by Carlos D'Andrea in the chat, so are these initiatives really an attempt for alternative forms of economic and political organizations, or are they initiatives that are coming from the commercial platforms? I think they're both. What is interesting, a reason that I was very much attracted in researching more the mutual aid networks is because, as perhaps you know, mutual aid is coming through anarchism, and it's very much attached to theories of anarchism and leftism. So those ideals are very much attached to a history of radical politics, which is being appropriated in these networks. So we see forms of this anti-state and anti-market organization, that they are real, and we see some forms of effective solidarity. But we also see, as I just mentioned, forms of appropriation that are very much trying to reconcile values of neoliberalism, values that we see in social media about, certain people being worth more than others, creating certain forms of visibility of individual leaders, if you like, people who perform in certain ways on social media as prescribed by the platform logic and so on, that coexist with those values of alternative social and economic organization. So I think this is this liminal space that we're seeing, that liminal space of crisis, that we see real ideological conflicts taking place. And what is interesting for me is, like, where will they take us? So will we see this new form of activism, of activists, this new generation of activists continuing and kind of learning a bit of these values of mutual aid and what it represents historically? Or will they just be absorbed as this new kind of individuals that gain, the 15 seconds of fame on social media, to put it crudely? I know there are other questions. I don't know, Paula, would you like me to?
Yes, maybe. May I ask you a question, and then I will read the Pablo's one. Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very thought-provoking lecture, and I think we're living in a very challenging times, as you point out. So you put this important question that what kind of world we'll have after this crisis, and I think we need to be hopeful that this pandemic is changing some values in a better way, like the emergence of this digital solidarity and other values. But yeah, here in Brazil, we can see these new networks of solidarity to help marginalized people to overcome this situation. But at the same time, we can see individualism in the way people act, like not wearing masks and denying the pandemic and doing whatever they want without thinking about the others. So I was thinking between this relationship between the individualism in this capitalist society and the solidarity. So if you could speak a bit more about this, I think it's an increasing individualism side by side with the solidarity. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, I think that's a very important question, and it's a question that is difficult to unravel, because I think what we see in solidarity and these new forms of solidarity is that ways that urban citizens, and especially privileged urban citizens, ways for them to reconcile to contradictory values, right? That of an inclusive and equitable society with intense individualism, and the intense individualism that we see in urban societies and in unequal societies very often. So I think that the COVID denialist perhaps is a minority. Hopefully, even in Brazil, they're a minority, though I know that they are expressed on the highest levels of governance. And I think this can only be understood within that peculiar context also of populism. That populism perhaps is trying to do the two together, that combines collective solidarity with intense individualism, where individuals can say, I don't care, this is what I believe and what my leader believes, and so on. But I know I'm rambling a bit because it's a different question to address, but the only thing I will say in conclusion is that what we see is that coexistence of solidarity and individualism. And it will be interesting to see if we have more sustained solidarity that actually goes beyond that individualism, which is very prominent and we see being reproduced now in urban forms of solidarity. So at the beginning, everybody was saying we're all in this together. And of course, very soon we realized that we're not in this together. So let's see if that solidarity will allow us to somehow imagine a world that we can be more together than we are now.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you very much, Myria. And we have a question from Pablo. In Brazil, the incidence rates of domestic violence and divorce have increased during the pandemic. What is your impression about this as a researcher in relation to the discussion about digital solidarity?
I think this has been a very difficult issue everywhere. Pablo, it's not only in Brazil, it is across many different countries from what I have seen. I would say, I would say especially in relation to domestic violence, there has been a very slow response across countries to the rising domestic crisis in the context of the pandemic. And this also was a striking reminder of how women, talking about different forms of inequalities being exaggerated, how women at the beginning of the crisis were completely ignored, and that experience of domestic violence was a non-issue. Then, of course, I think in different ways, different societies and different states responded to the problems with domestic violence. But from my experience, from where I am, what I have seen is that the response has been largely inadequate, not effective enough, largely because the whole crisis came within a society that has already been suffering from austerity and from the collapse of many public services. So it was very difficult when neoliberalism and austerity has already destroyed many of the structures of support that should be there for women or children who are victims of domestic violence. It was very difficult to suddenly, because of the pandemic, to offer the support that is required. So I think it's again a very obvious case of existing inequalities and the results of austerity and neoliberalism becoming even more exaggerated in the case of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat. It is new from Thales Dutra. If these new networks of solidarity are discovering and getting in touch with traditional activists or social movements, would it be possible to think about political coalition uniting these networks in the future? Can digital solidarity take the streets outside of online space?
Yeah, great question again. Great question. I mean, the quick answer is that hopefully. A bit more informed answer would be that I think the rise of the heterogeneous networks that we've seen coming together around demonstrations across the world in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement is a proof of how we might allow ourselves to be cautiously optimistic, because I think what we have seen in different cities of the world is that the different expressions of the Black Lives Matter movement has emerged through the networks of digital solidarity, because let us not forget that the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in the context of the pandemic, right? So a lot of the organization and a lot of the mobilization behind those movements has taken place digitally. And I have seen in these mutual aid groups, for example, a lot of crossings between different kinds of expressions of political action. So calls to demonstration in relation to Black Lives Matter have been circulating systematically in those networks and so on. So I think even though we have to be aware of the complexities and the contradictions of these solidarity movements that have to do, of course, with the enormous grasp of neoliberalism and neoliberal and racial ideologies over public life, we shouldn't forget that we have seen also glimpses, at least, of politics that are hopeful, and that they recognize the need also to collaborate and build bigger coalitions in the context of everyday life, but also in a more kind of political way.
I think we have time just for one more question, maybe, because we still have just 5 minutes. So, Paula, do you have any there?
No, you can.
Is there any other from the chat? No?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So, yeah, Myria, I agree with you. It's our responsibility to think about the present. It's a hard task. It's really a hard task, but we have to, because decisions are being made. And what we, the intellectuals, are seeing and saying and showing is important even for policymakers. Even if many of the politicians don't want to make the change we want to, but still, I think I agree with you. And it's very important and very positive to hear you and to you and other scholars who were thinking about this at this very moment, which is changing, and we don't know exactly what's going on, but we're still doing our work. Well, I think we haven't worked so much. And some people just think, oh, okay, you're not teaching, you're not going to school, you're not going, but yeah, because we have so many questions, and I think that issues that we were concerned about before the pandemic, they become more acute, they become more important now, because the divide is bigger, the class differences, inequalities are getting more and more evident. So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we have another question in the meantime.
Edie?
Paula, should I take that question?
Oh, yes, we still have like 4 minutes. If you can answer, Luciana Furtado. The question is, could these initiatives of digital solidarity accidentally become a way to exempt the government or corporations of responsibility for their actions? When I say this, I'm thinking about the mining companies that had dam bursts a few years ago. Common citizens mobilized to help out the victims, and it was very positive, but also distracted from the company's responsibility.
Yeah, again, a very important question. I think I did mention in passing a couple of times the free labor of activists and volunteers. So yes, I think this kind of self-organizing and mutual aid is very often used for the state and the market to get out of its responsibilities. So that's why it's not enough to do solidarity. It's very important to also speak of solidarity and the values behind mutual aid. Why are these networks working outside the state and the market? Not only because they need to fill in the gaps, but because they have to actually challenge those structures that reproduce inequalities, that reproduce the privilege that perhaps Luciana's question implies. So a very, very good point, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Myria. It was a pleasure to have you here, and hopefully we'll meet in presence soon. So, Laura.
Thank you, Paula, for being with us, for the translation, for being such a great moderator. Thank you, Myria.
Just to say that I saw that there were a few comments while I was speaking, and many of them are in Portuguese, so I will try to navigate them later. I want to thank the people who have posted comments, and I will try to, again, get to the heart of them. And thank you, absolutely, especially Laura and Paula, but everybody who has participated today.
Thank you, Myria. See you hopefully soon. Bye-bye.